All right, so we are in Daniel chapter 10. And let's see, who was here last week when we started? Or 2 weeks ago? Gosh, 2 weeks ago? You were here, Rachel was here, Scott, Julia.
Oh, yeah, it was Joshua's birthday.
It was Joshua's birthday, that's right. The rest of you were slackers, that's fine. This is a section of scripture that is about the period between the last prophet in the Old Testament and the time of Jesus. Does anybody know who the last prophet in the Old Testament is, by the way? No, not Elijah. Deborah. No, she's a judge. She's like way early. We sometimes joke and say he's the Italian prophet. It's Malachi. And Malachi is actually the last prophet in your Bible in the Old Testament, which is entirely coincidental. He also happens to be the last prophet who writes around, I don't know, 400 or so BC, maybe 450-ish. And so the time between his ministry, which is after the exile, right, after they've come back from Babylon, and the time of Christ is roughly 450 years. It's sometimes called the silent period. And it's called that because in that period, we have no records of God choosing a prophet and speaking to anybody in particular, which is then recorded as a book in the Bible. So it's thought, well, God was just silent there, and then the next work that he does is, is the arrival of Christ. And we're in Advent season with all of our decorations starting to go up. So that's what we should be thinking about and celebrating over the next 4, 5, or 6 weeks. But instead of giving the history as it's unfolding, yes, sure.
Why is he the Italian prophet? I'm sorry.
Malachi.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's sometimes how people pretend to say it. Instead of giving the history as it unfolds, God actually gives us the history in advance, and he gives us the history in advance here in Daniel chapter 10 and partially in chapter 11. I'm sorry, we're actually in chapter 11. What, Lolo? Well, that's why they invented erasers. So, where we were, I remember Daniel had started to pray, and he had been praying, and he had been actually praying for 3 weeks, and 3 weeks into his prayer, an angel shows up and says, hey, I was dispatched right when you started praying 3 weeks ago, but the Prince of Persia withstood me. So we talked about the fact that we've got, I guess, a good angel who's come to see Daniel and give him this insight. But we've also got whoever this Prince of Persia is, which looks like it's a bad angel. Remember, when Satan fell, how many of the angels did he take with him? A third, right? So he takes a third with him. So what we learn from this is that angels do oppose angels. And we also learn that there appears to be some geographic boundaries for angels, because the Prince of Persia is mentioned, but then also later the Prince of Greece is mentioned, right? So and the spiritual world is something we don't get a ton of insight into in scripture, right? There are times and places, if you want like some weird stuff, go read the book of Jude in the New Testament. It's only one chapter, and you'll see all sorts of odd things in there, like the fact that Satan fought with Michael for Moses's body. You're like, well, we don't see that anywhere else in the Bible. So what's that all about? Well, maybe it has to do with Moses being one of the 2 witnesses in the book of Revelation. Anyway, when the angel is actually starting to tell Daniel what's going to happen, he starts talking about 2 sets of kings. There's the king of the north and the king of the south. And these kings will change over time, right? But it's always referred to as the king of the north and the king of the south. And so we then have to go through history and try and figure out, well, who's he talking about in which part of the prophecy. But remember what happens after Alexander the Great conquers all of, this is, by the way, this is India, for those of you who, missed it last time. Saudi Arabia's here, Turkey's up here, this is Greece, and then Egypt is in here, okay? And then our little square here is Israel. So remember, there's 4 generals who basically split up Alexander's empire. There's Lysander, Cassander and Lysimachus. Sort of, they're up in here. Okay, they're not really players in this set of prophecies that Daniel's going to be given. But the 2 that are big are actually the king of the south, Ptolemy, and the king of the north, Seleucus. And these are the guys who are going to have dynasties that we'll learn about through history. So we started with Ptolemy the First and Seleucus the First around 280 BC. And what you notice here is Israel is kind of in the middle between 2. So these guys, when they fight, are constantly going back and forth across Israel. And Israel changes hands. And we'll even see that tonight, where Israel is promised as part of a dowry. So it's important to understand that by the time you've got to Jesus's time, right, and the Romans have taken over, Israel is this place that doesn't just get to sit out at the crossroads and mind its own business. It's always in play, okay? And again, by the time the Romans have sort of taken over all of this when Jesus is born and Jesus' ministry, well, over here, it's not called the Seleucid Empire anymore, but there's another empire over here called Parthia, which is actually a big empire in its own right, although we don't really read much about it. And so you've got the Parthian Empire and the Romans, and they're at war, right? And they've gone back and forth through Israel. So what happens at the time of Jesus' birth, right? With the story in Matthew, who shows up? The Magi show up, and they are from where? They're from the east. Guess what? They're from over here. Okay? And when they show up, how is Jerusalem described? Right? Herod is troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Right? So when you think about this, and you think about your Christmas cards, and you put up your manger sets, and you've got your 3 little wise men out by themselves on camels and stuff, right? This is probably not 3 guys, in robes on camels who are traveling by themselves. Why would that disturb? Why would that even make news in Jerusalem? Okay, right? This is probably a group of these magi whose job in Persia and the Parthian Empire was to pick kings who show up in Jerusalem. Probably, my guess is, with some kind of military escort in a caravan that's big enough that people go, hey, who's that? Who? Oh, they're Parthians. Who? Oh, what's going to happen now? And what do they ask Herod? Well, who is king of the Jews?
Supposedly Herod.
Yeah, right. So Herod, it's like showing up at the White House and saying, hey, show us who was really elected. Right?
But if you're Russian.
Well, yeah, but if you're Russian, yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Right. That's a good analogy. And so, Herod gets all upset, like rightly so, because he's like, well, now wait a minute, are they going to come in and challenge my authority as king? Right? So all of that unfolds in the time of Jesus' birth, but it's all set up back here in the 300 or 400 years before Jesus is born. All right, so all that makes sense, kind of, sort of. Okay, so last time we got through, we got through, I think, verse 8, okay? So remember, the story was that at the time, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, has a daughter named Berenice. And this is around 270 BC. We said Ptolemy II is the guy who establishes the Great Library at Alexandria, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, who sent, collected all these books and everything and then burns down. He gives Berenice to a guy named Antiochus II to sort of try and end the conflict between the two. Well, the other problem is Antiochus II is already married to a gal named Laodice, who doesn't take kindly to being put aside. And she basically kills everybody and puts her own son into the throne. And now Ptolemy III has gone out, and he basically comes out and goes up, tackles Seleucus here, and comes back. And we said that he came back with lots of gold, lots of silver, and the northern king's gods. And where we left off last week was, or 2 weeks ago, was saying that if somebody can ride into your house and steal your gods and take them back to his house, you probably have the wrong gods. Okay, that's where we ended. All right, so we're now in verses 9 and 10. Okay, so the two guys in play right now are, I think it's Ptolemy III, who ended up being Berenice's brother. He's the guy who's going to avenge Berenice's death. And Seleucus II. Those are our two guys right now. King of the South, Ptolemy III, King of the North, Seleucus II. Okay? And it says also, in verse 9 and 10, it says, also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the south, but shall return to his own land. However, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his own fortress and stir up strife. So, after a couple of years, Seleucus reorganizes and marches south against Egypt. Unfortunately, he gets beat up pretty bad, and he returns back north with only a fraction of his army. So now he's got a son whose name is Seleucus the third, and he gets murdered. And Antiochus the third, who is going to be Antiochus the Great, who's going to kind of take over next. Okay, now so he's the Great. Okay. And he's going to recover some fortresses up in here and do some things, but then he reconquers some area up here, and then he's going to resume the war with Egypt. And in verse 11 and 12 it says, and the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, but that multitude shall be given into the hand of the enemy. And when he was taken away, the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but will not prevail. All right. So Ptolemy the third is now out of the picture, and we've got Ptolemy the fourth. And this is about, let's see, must be about 212 BC. And he's going to lead a big army. And they're going to march through Judea until they meet in Lebanon. But he's going to get routed, and he'll retreat back south. And initially, the army that Ptolemy IV has is going to be bigger than the army of Seleucus. I'm sorry, Antiochus III. Ptolemy's going to have about 70,000 men. Antiochus III is going to have about 60,000 men. Antiochus is actually going to get defeated at this battle. He's going to lose about 10,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. So it's a big battle. 10,000 guys on the king of the north side are going to die. And you've got to imagine a pretty good number of the guys on the south side are going to die as well. And this, I think I said last time, this is the first time, and maybe the only known battle we have where war elephants are involved, where Ptolemy brings forth his war elements that are African war elements, which are now extinct, and Antiochus brings Indian war elephants, which are not extinct, and the African elephants are actually smaller than the Indian elephants. And the Indian elephants rout the small elephants and chase them away, but the elephants don't really matter in that. It's just an interesting side note that it's the only battle we know of where the two types of elephants actually get into conflict. So Ptolemy celebrates his victory up here, and he is going to come back on his way to Egypt. And while he's in Jerusalem, he's actually going to try to enter the Holy of Holies, right? So not only does he go into the temple area, remember there was a temple area that had the court of the Gentiles where a Gentile could go in, and then the court of the women, and then kind of the court of the men, and then you get into the actual temple, and then inside the temple, the heart of the temple was the Holy of Holies, where only who could go? Only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. Right, and the Levites are the priests. That's exactly right. And he is prevented from going into the Holy of Holies by paralysis. Right? He tries to go in, and he's struck with paralysis. Right? And so he's actually taken back down to the south, and he's obviously kind of upset about that, and he takes out his revenge on the Jewish people who are living in Alexandria. Okay? All right. So, verses 13 through 16. So, Ptolemy fourth down here, Antiochus the third up here. Ptolemy the fourth is going to die. Okay, so that's the end of it for him. And now we're going to get into Ptolemy the fifth. And for it says, "For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fail." So who's the angel talking to? Who are Daniel's people? The Jewish people. So not only now are we talking about Seleucus or Antiochus III kind of coming south, but he says, hey, some violent Jewish guys are going to rise up to try and fulfill some vision, right? Which is probably independence for Jerusalem, but they're going to fail. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist, but he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction and power. Okay? So, after the death of Ptolemy IV, his son, Ptolemy V, they're not very great on inventive names, okay, will succeed him. But he's only 4 years old, right? Like when he's only 4 at the time he takes the throne, okay? And so 12 years after this battle where Antiochus gets his butt kicked, he'll come back down south, right, with a big army. And the many that stand up against the king of the south includes Antiochus, right, who's here, but he also brings Philip of Macedon down to another Philip, as well as some uprising of vassals here in Egypt. And in 200, so he tries to wrestle all of Judea and south from Ptolemy. And he gets, Ptolemy here has some success, but then ultimately he gets defeated and nobody is able to stand against Antiochus III. So he actually, Antiochus III, takes Israel and is welcomed as a liberator. That's what the Jewish people think at the time. They're happy to be out from under the yoke of the Ptolemies in the south. Okay? So, Antiochus III the Great is called Antiochus Epiphanes. The Jews will come to call him by another name, Antiochus Epimanes, means the madman, because we're gonna find out he's a little bit wacky. All right. I know this is a lot. I know it's a lot of history and everything that's going on here, and battles and who's who of which Ptolemies and which Antiochuses and or which Seleucids are doing what. But it's actually really interesting once you sort of try and follow all the players and what's happening, and then come back and compare it. The whole point is being able to compare what happens historically with what happened, or what Daniel's being told in terms of the prophecy here. So verse 17, he says, he shall also, he, meaning Antiochus Epiphanes, shall set his face with the strength of his whole, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of the whole kingdom, and upright ones with him, thus he shall do. And he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or be for him. After this, he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and he shall take many, but a ruler shall bring reproach against them to an end, and with reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Okay, you look at that, you go, what does all of that mean, right? That's kind of like, how do I even figure all of that out? So let's talk about the history. In 197, Antiochus III, is 197 BC. Antiochus III sets out to attack Asia Minor, Cilicia, Lycia, and Caria, which are under Egyptian control. However, he's defeated by a new power in the region, Rome. Okay, so we're at a place in history around 197-ish BC that Rome starts to rise and make its presence felt, right? And of course, Rome is off the map right over here. Draw my boot. Okay? Look. Now, Antiochus has a daughter named Cleopatra.
Wrong Cleopatra, not the one I think.
It is. This is Cleopatra the First, the one that you think of all the time when you think of actual Cleopatra, and Mark Antony is Cleopatra the Seventh. But this is the first Cleopatra, okay? And she is going to be given in marriage to Ptolemy the Fifth. And his whole idea here is, look, I'm going to give my daughter over to Ptolemy, and she's going to have influence on Ptolemy, and I'm going to be able to get what I want, because he'll fall in love with her, and he'll do what she wants, and she's on my side. And yet, as the prophecy says, she shall not stand with him or before him. Cleopatra goes over to Ptolemy's side, right? She falls in love with her husband and actually ends up doing what he wants. Right? So Antiochus is thoroughly upset, but as part of the dowry, there's a bunch of territory that's supposed to change hands, including Judea. And so that means the Ptolemies in the south are supposed to get Judea back, right? But they don't, because ultimately Antiochus never actually gives the land. Okay, so in 196, Antiochus turns towards Greece. So he's defeated here, but a year later, he's going to come back and try another campaign. It's actually Hannibal. Remember Hannibal? Mm-hmm. The general, and Hannibal's the one who goes through the mountains and goes through the Alps with elephants and things like that. Hannibal is the one who encourages Antiochus V to fight with the Romans again, but he's again defeated at a battle called Thermopylae. So you should look that up. That's another interesting battle. And he's in 190 BC. His army of 80,000 people suffered defeat in a decisive battle near Smyrna, with the Roman commander forcing him to renounce all of his claims on Europe and Asia Minor. And so he surrenders all this territory over to the Romans, and has to pay in what his time would have counted. It's 15 talents of silver, but would have been over $30 million. That's the fee he's got to pay for losing the war, right? And of course, he takes it out. You know, he comes back and he takes it out on his kingdom, right? So he increases because, hey, if I'm out $30 million, I got to get that back. How am I going to get it back? Increase taxes. Okay, so he increases the taxes, and he wasn't a happy guy. Okay. Verse 20. There shall arise one in his place who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom. And what's the glorious kingdom? Israel. Yep. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of the flood they shall be swept away before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people, and he shall enter peaceably even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the stronghold, but only for a time. So now you got Antiochus the fourth. And I think in here there's another guy named Seleucus. Yeah, there's a Seleucus the fourth in here too. We don't really read much about him. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm wrong. I told you Antiochus the third he is the great, but these names actually apply to Antiochus the fourth. So again, this is why you have erasers. Sorry about that. Okay. So what happens? So Seleucus the fourth succeeds Antiochus the third, and he rules for about 12 years, and then he's murdered by his treasurer. And the treasurer kills him, hoping that he's going to be able to take over the kingdom, right? Because if you got the purse strings, why not? Well, he's outmaneuvered by Antiochus the fourth, who actually does come and take over the kingdom. And Antiochus the fourth has actually served time in Rome as a hostage. So it wasn't uncommon, like, and you still see it on TV shows about the ancient days where, I guess even like the Game of Thrones kind of thing, where somebody would say, well, to ensure my good conduct against you and your family, I'm going to give you Dash, right? And presumably I care enough about Dash that I don't want him to be killed, so that will, work in your favor to guarantee my conduct. Of course, if I don't, care about Dash, like, I'm going to give you Dash, but I don't really care about him, so, I'm going to do what I want. But we wouldn't give you as a hostage, Dash, I promise. Feel better? All right.
Now we get that. Done.
So,
Is it Dusty or me, Lauren?
You.
Answer honestly.
okay, so Seleucus's treasurer has Seleucus killed. Seleucus has an infant son. Antiochus the fourth basically has the infant son killed and the treasurer and takes over. So he takes over through intrigue, which is why it says he shall not have the honor of royalty. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so at this point, remember that the dowry down here for Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I was supposed to be, Israel was supposed to be part of that. It's never given. Ptolemy decides he's going to go and try and take it. And eventually he will fight Antiochus IV here in Egypt, or sorry, in Israel, and Ptolemy V will be defeated. Now, the Prince of the Covenant refers at this time to the Jewish high priest, probably, who is Onias. And Antiochus has him murdered in 170 as he's trying to consolidate his power. And unlike his fathers, Antiochus IV robbed all the richest places that were under his control. So anything that had, money, he was out to get. And there ends up being a power contest down here, ultimately between Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VII. So these guys, he has two sons, Ptolemy VI and the VII. And ultimately, the guy who wins is the sixth. And so now what we have is Ptolemy VI down here, Antiochus IV down here. Okay? Clear as mud?
Sure.
Okay. So, verses 25 through 28. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. So, Antiochus IV is going to stir up his power, right? And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. He shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table. But it shall not prosper, for the end will be at the appointed time. And while returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. So, after Antiochus IV grows strong enough, he comes down to attack Ptolemy VI in about 170 BC, and he gets all the way to the Nile. He's like sneaking in. He gets all the way to the Nile Delta before he's discovered. And so he had been trying to pretend he was an ally, and ultimately, the people who helped Antiochus sneak down here are Ptolemy VI's closest confidants. So there's all. I mean, you can make a great mini series about these, 30 verses in Daniel, right? That's going to span a couple of hundred years and have all this court intrigue and battles and kind of all this fun stuff. He will try and fight Antiochus, but his army falls apart, and he'll ultimately end up surrendering. And there's a peace conference here, but it's not really much of a peace conference because he surrenders and he's going to return home with lots of plunder. Now, this is an interesting thing. In about 169 BC, he's going to come back through Israel. And there are two of you in here who actually have the account of that in your Bibles.
This is Maccabees.
You have it in Maccabees. Yes. Yep. So you and you Protestants don't have what we call the Apocrypha, kind of the extra books, but they are included in the Catholic Bible. And it's in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 20 through 28. And it says, after subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in the 143rd year. So that's, I know I'm saying it's 169 BC, but that's because the way the Jews reckon time is different than the way the secular world reckons time. And he says, he went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He also took the table for the bread of the presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the gold decoration on the front of the temple. He stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. He also took the hidden treasures that he found. Taking all of them, he went into his own land. He shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. Israel mourned deeply in every community. Rulers and elders groaned. Young women and young men became faint. The beauty of the women faded. Every bridegroom took up the lament. She who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning. Even the land trembled for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame. So he plunders the temple and comes back here, but this is not when he tries to set up himself to be worshipped yet. So remember we talked about that abomination of desolation, right? Jesus talks about it. Daniel is going to talk about it. And what that really is Antiochus, the madman, is ultimately going to try and set himself up in the sanctuary to be worshipped. And that's what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 24, maybe it's 25, but I think it's 24, now it's 25, that it's going to happen again. And that's where we say, oh, that must be yet future because it hasn't happened again. All right. Chapter 11, verses 29 to 35. At the appointed time, he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. So at the appointed time, Antiochus IV is going to come back towards the south. So sometime, and who's going to appoint the time? God will appoint the time, right? God will sort of, I don't know whether God has a specific plan, for example, for all of us, right? I don't know if God has a plan for Dash to be a pilot and for Julie to be a nurse. I don't know if God really deals with us on that level. We can argue that he does, and I think then we're left to start talking about, well, what happens when we don't follow his plan? Is that why bad things happen? But how do we know his plan? But I do know that God has an overall plan of history. Right, and that overall plan of history starts in Genesis with the announcement that there's going to be a Messiah to redeem the fallen, Adam and Eve.
I think there's a general kind for us to believe how to the way
I tend to think that's right. There's a general plan. And I think it's true that God does love us, but I think God gives us free will, and we can be pilots, and we can be engineers, and we can be lawyers, and we can do, kind of all of that stuff, and we can pick this school over that school, and God will use us or can use us no matter whether we go to this school or that school or no school at all. Right? God can do all of that when he wants to. But I do know when I think that's sort of plan with a little p, but when you think about, and I think you read in scripture, God's plan with a big P, it's all about setting history in motion and putting things in play that lead to ultimately here the birth of Christ, and then ultimately will lead to Christ's return and the establishment of the kingdom and the 1,000-year reign of Christ and ultimate victory. So when you think of what's God's plan, I don't know what God's plan for you is, if he has a plan for you, but I know God does have a plan with a capital P. And if you happen to be in a place like Seleucus, Antiochus is, or the Ptolemies are, God can move you. Like, God can move you to be in a place to fulfill what's happening or what he needs to have done with his plan. Remember it says he raises up kings, and that was whole part of the early part of Daniel where we talked about Nebuchadnezzar, where God says, hey, guess what? Everybody's going to be under Nebuchadnezzar. That's my plan for now. All the animals, all the kingdoms, all the people, Nebuchadnezzar's going to be the God, right? And so that's the way it was going to be. All right. At the appointed time, he shall return and go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter, for ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved, and return in a rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress and they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Okay. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet as many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of those understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them, and make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still the appointed time. Okay, you look at that and you go, man, what's going on here? Okay, so as he comes south, right, this is his second campaign against Egypt, and he's less successful than the first time. The first time he got in, he took over everything and forced a peace. This time, he's not even going to take Alexandria. Furthermore, he's going to encounter the Roman Navy. Okay, so the Roman Navy is going to come, sail, oars on. Actually looks like a ship, right? Or kind of looks like a ship. Okay, and the Roman fleet under a guy named Caius Popilius Linus sails from Cyprus, which is what, over here somewhere, to Egypt. And he will defeat a guy named Perseus of Macedon, who was an ally of Antiochus. And Antiochus, so the Romans, after this defeat, the Romans sent an ambassador to Antiochus, a guy named Caius Popilius, who is the fleet admiral. And basically what Rome said is, look, knock it off. We're tired of you. We're tired of this. Stop going against Egypt. The Roman Senate has basically said you will cease and desist, or we're going to take care of business. And we've already beaten you once. We'll come and we'll beat you again. And Antiochus is a shifty character, right? We already know he's a bad dude. He's a shifty character. He says, hey, thanks for the order. Let me go and consult my people. Let me go and consult my advisors, right? And I'll let you know, what's going to happen. So basically, he's playing for time. He's trying to get us to escape. Well, it's said that Caius Popilius takes a bunch of salt and draws it around in a circle around Antiochus. And he says, look, dude, you step out of that circle without making your decision, we're just going to kill you now. So you make your decision. Either way is okay with us. We don't care. But you're not going home to, pretend to talk to all your advisors and then turn against us. You either agree to this now, or we'll just take care of it now.
Either way, I'm there.
Right, exactly. I don't have time for you. And Antiochus, of course, says, fine, I will cease and desist. But you can imagine that he goes home kind of enraged. Okay. Now, as he's coming back through here, there's also a bunch of stuff going on in Jerusalem. The high priest was somebody who was sort of a high priest by heredity. Okay. Well, this guy named Jason wants to be high priest. And he knows that Antiochus is a guy that you can buy, right? So he says, hey, Antiochus, I want to be high priest. I give you some money. Can you make that happen? Antiochus says, well, how much money? He says, well, enough, right? Okay, great. Fine, I'll make it happen. And so they depose the existing high priest. Now, another guy named Menelaus says, well, if Jason can do that, I can do it too. Hey, Antiochus, how much did he give you? Give me $100. I'll give you $110. Okay, cool. Great. I'll do that. That's fine. It's another $110. So Antiochus cooperates again. Jason, right, doesn't like that. And Ananias, who was the one who was actually the rightful high priest, he objects. He says, hey, you can't do that. That is wrong, and that's not the way it works. And Antiochus just has him. So he's not a good guy. Jason, something happens and somebody tries to move against Antiochus, and Jason, the first guy who bribed him, thought Antiochus got killed, but he didn't. So Jason tries to lead this uprising and ultimately fails, and he himself is killed because by Antiochus, who is not in fact dead. Rumors of his death have been greatly exaggerated. And Antiochus then finally comes in and enters Jerusalem, and he's got about 80,000 people, and he will be accompanied by Menelaus, the second guy who gave him $105 or whatever it was, who is now the high priest, and this is when he will desecrate the temple. So in verse 31, and the forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they'll take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Well, remember back in chapter 9, right? When we have the 70-week prophecy. And one of the key things about that is in that last week, that 70th week, the middle of that period, that's when the prince that shall come, right, who we decided is the Antichrist, will cause the daily sacrifices to stop. Because if you're Jewish and you can't sacrifice, you can't be right with God. Now, today they would say, well, we do sacrifices of service and offerings and money and things like that. But that's not what the law calls for. If you're under the law, you've got to be sacrificing in the temple. And if you're the bad guy and you cause the sacrifice to stop, you cause all sorts of havoc. Okay, so he does this. This is what's called the famed abomination of desolation. You can read about it in 2nd Maccabees, and it's in chapters 5 and 6 there. You can also read it in a book by a guy named Josephus, who we've talked about before, right? Josephus is this Jewish historian who works for the Romans. He's got a book called Antiquities, and in chapter 12, you can read about this. This is a very, very bad time for the Jewish people. Yeah, he will slay a pig kind of on the altar, and it's just bad time. So here's what it says in this actually says it in 1st Maccabees, the end of 1st Maccabees. Now on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of the burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore into pieces and burned with fire. And anyone possessing the book of the covenant or anyone adhering to the law was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered a sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offerings, which I think is the sow. And according to the decree, they then put to death the women who had their children circumcised and their families who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. Right? So you had your baby circumcised, they killed the baby, and then they hung it around your neck as a necklace. And you had to walk around like that, or else they were going to kill you too. Antiochus's actions are a foreshadowing of what's going to happen. And this ultimately is what leads to the Maccabean revolt, right? So the Maccabees, after this period of time, led by Judaeus Maccabeus, will revolt against Antiochus, and they will take back the temple. And they will barricade themselves in the temple. And the problem is, they're trying to reconsecrate everything, but they only have so much oil, right? And so they're like, well, okay, what do we, how the holy oil is going to run out before we can reconsecrate the altars and everything else. What do we do? So what happens?
Is this Hanukkah?
This is Hanukkah, right? There's a miracle, and the oil lasts for 7 nights. And so they're able to reconsecrate the temple and kind of kick Antiochus out and resume the sacrifices and worship. So, okay, so we're going to stop here. We're almost done with chapter 11. I know that's a lot. I know it's kind of, it can be kind of dry, and it's, you know, there's a lot, especially if you just read the verses, like, and you look at that, you go, how do I get any of this detail out of there? There's no way I can get the detail out of it. But if you go back and start looking at the history and say, well, okay, who are they talking about? And then you go back and you find all the commentators who talk about, well, okay, it's this guy, and then this happens, and, you know, oh, Berenice kills all these people, and then, you know, Cleopatra is down here, and she marries, and she's supposed to be for her dad, but she's not for her dad, right? That, I mean, it's a whole days of our lives kind of thing going on.
I think I need more colors. Like, more than what we've got, I need more colors.
You need more colors. Well, so next time, what we're going to talk about, we're going to get into verses 36 through the end of the chapter. And we're really, really close now to finishing the book of Daniel, because chapter 12 is really not very long at all. So we've got 10 verses left in chapter 11, and then all of chapter 12, which we may be able to finish all in one time next time. But we're going to see, you know, a transition from talking about guys that we can identify to a guy that's going to be called the willful king. And we start going, well, who's that? Because the description that we now, like, up until now, we've actually been able to tie what's been in the scripture to the kings and the events that happened. And that's one of the reasons why we look at it and go, wow, God really does tell the future, you know, and he does it way before it actually happens. So it gives us confidence that when God says, hey, this is going to happen, it actually happens, right? So there's no reason, if God has, you know, if we look at the Old Testament, we say, well, God's talking about all this stuff that happened, or that from an Old Testament perspective, he says, hey, I know what's going to happen over here, and here it is. And that's what the prophets are here to tell you. You know, all this stuff's going to happen. And then as we read through, we go, oh, wow, it happened, right? That's actually what occurred. So when we look at New Testament stuff, and we look at what Jesus says and things like that, and we look at what Paul then says about what's yet to come, there's no reason why we should have any doubt. God, I think, has given us plenty of examples and plenty of evidence that when he says this is going to happen, that it's going to happen. And we should be confident in that. So when you find your faith in a place like, man, I don't know if God knows what he's doing, or I don't know if what God's doing in my life. Look, remember, he's got that plan with a capital P, right? And that is moving forward. And at the right time, I think that what that plan is he's going to rapture the church. And then the events for Revelation are going to set in place, which are largely to do with the Jews, right? So remember, John is a Jew. His ministry is to other Jews. When you look at the apostles in the New Testament, the original 12 disciples, the original 12 apostles, they're all Jewish. They don't really go out of their way to do ministry to the Gentiles. Who's the minister to the Gentiles? Paul. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. So when John writes his gospel, and John writes the book of Revelation, we look at who they deal with, it's largely to the Jews. So we'll talk about who the willful king is next, and we'll see this transition from guys that we can identify to who we think is the Antichrist. We think the willful king is another name, is one of those terms that's being used for the Antichrist. All right. Any questions? Can you imagine if you were Daniel? Okay, not only has an angel showed up in the middle of your prayer, and you're falling down, and they're like, get up, come on, we got stuff to talk about, right?
Take notes.
Take notes. And then he starts talking about, yeah, look, there's kings of the north and there's kings of the south. Now pay attention, because we're going to move fast here. We got, 40 verses or so we're going to talk through. There's a lot going to happen. He's going to come here. He's going to go there. This is going to work. This isn't going to work. Oh, that's bad. That's going to happen.
Which he are we talking about here?
Right. You really have to, you kind of do have to color code who the he's are. And in fact, if you're using an online version where you can highlight, you actually could go in there and say, well, he will do this. Now, which he is that? Oh, wait, that's the king of the north. So we're going to call the king of the north. Perfect. And we're gonna call King of the South green, and so you can highlight who's who and who they're talking about at different, at which time. So, make sense?
Very much.
Clear as mud, okay. All right. So, anybody want to close this out first? Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
I wonder how you reach that conclusion. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us all together today to learn more about your word and the prophecy that you came to fulfill. Lord, thank you for the wonderful food from Mother and for the opportunity to all eat together and socialize and learn more. And please just keep us safe throughout the week, especially Emily's grandma, helping her recover properly. Be healthy, Lord. In your name, I pray.
Amen.